right, we have just gone past 6:30 on Monday, the 6th of October. So I think it's right on time for us to kick off with our latest CRA live briefing. My name is Chris Hattingh. I am the Executive Director at the Centre for Risk Analysis. Thank you everyone for joining us on this Monday evening as we're now into October after first few months of the second administration of US President Trump and the GNU now over 1 year old. Lots of domestic and international political developments that we have analyzed for you at the CRA this year. This evening's discussion is going to bring to a sort of focus point two of the most recent domestic developments in South Africa. We're going to look at the announcement, Helen Zille, that she's going to contest for the mayorship, the next local government elections in Johannesburg for the Democratic Alliance. And then, of course, we have the guilty finding against the guilty judgment against EFF leader Julius Malema. Does this mean the end of him? Does it mean the end of the EFF? We'll get into the DA and Helen Zille's prospects, and we'll also get into the implications of that particular verdict for Julius Malema and the EFF. Joining me this evening, we have Head of Strategic Communications from the Institute of Race Relations, Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, thank you very much for making time here for the CRA once again. We're also joined, last but by no means least, by Mr. Sean McLaughlin. Sean, an independent analyst, widely published, Daily Friend, Biz News, a few other publications that I'm sure I'm forgetting. And Sean, you can please correct me anytime. But Sean is also delving deeply into South African ward and provincial politics to try and make sense of this shifting landscape. So we look forward to what the both of you will tell us this evening and help us understand what's going on in South African politics here at the beginning of October. Very last point, just around sort of administrative logistics issues, matters. This briefing will be recorded. So if at any point, if you are load shed, if your fiber connection decides to leave you in the lurch, you can always come back to the recording. Also, if you have any questions or comments for any of us, please pop those in the comment box on the platform on which you are watching. And I will handle the easy questions, and I'll give the difficult questions to Hermann and to Sean. All right, we're going to kick off the discussion now. Hermann, I'm going to start with you. Firstly, on Ms. Zille's mayoral candidacy. Is it slam dunk that she will win the mayorship in Johannesburg in the next local government elections?
No. I'm assuming that there's an implied, please elaborate on the answer. So it is by no means a slam dunk. What I think you can take to the bank is the fact that the DA will be the largest party in the Joburg City Council. However, that is not to say that they are well placed to necessarily form a government. If the ANC falls to around 20%, perhaps even lower in the city, and the DA grows to the mid to high 30s as the current state or the latest polls that I've seen, then quite obviously the DA will be 17 percentage points larger than the ANC. But that is quite still a far way off from the 50% plus one that will be needed for forming a government. Now, if you look at a city like Tshwane, the metro area that covers the capital city of Pretoria, the DA is not only stronger here in terms of having historically performed better in local government elections and is currently polling in the mid to high 40s, you also have the situation here that you have a relatively strong Freedom Front Plus, you have the presence of the ACDP, and the likelihood of a coalition between either the DA and the Freedom Front Plus, or those two parties in the ACDP to get to a majority of seats in council is quite firmly established. I mean, it's very much in the realm of possibility in Tshwane. In Johannesburg, however, the calculus is cruel, especially towards the DA. And they do not have a strong ACDP or Freedom Front Plus necessarily to be their natural coalition partners in the city. And that means, of course, that they will have to get far closer to 50% themselves if they want to form a coalition government that does not include the ANC, the EFF, or MK. So essentially, Richard Wilkinson's analysis published on the Daily Friend of this, I would recommend to everyone to read. Essentially, the DA would have to get around 48%, perhaps even a bit more, of the vote in Johannesburg to be able to form a non-ANC, non-EFF, non-MK government. It's possible. It certainly is sort of just about within the realms of possibility. The question becomes, is Zilla's presence on the ticket worth 13, 15 percentage points? Some enthusiastic DA insiders believe that to be the case. But nevertheless, it'll be an uphill battle. The odds of the DA being the largest party, very good. Odds of the DA getting the mayoralty, considerably different question.
Sean, to you, around, after the election, the different parties are trying to figure out, what direction should they go. I'm hoping that they would have gamed some of these scenarios beforehand. And if they need some scenario planning, that is one of the services that we at the CRA offer. So, just putting it out there. But Sean, to you, if you look at the sort of this possible constellations for how things would look with a DA-led mayoral council, in terms of who gets what do you think is the highest probability? Are you seeing sort of a grand coalition maybe that's the best sort of, from a stability point of view, sort of DA plus ANC in Johannesburg?
Yeah, I have rather a lot to say about this, so I need to organize my thoughts very meticulously. So, yeah, I mean, first of all, I think, make no mistake, that I think this is the biggest play in South African politics at the moment. And for anyone interested in politics anywhere in the Anglosphere, I find it rather fascinating. She, obviously, Helen Zille, putting her hat in the ring, announcing the possibility that she would be the DA's candidate back in, I think it was June, and then that only got confirmed maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago now. As Hermann says, the DA really would want to get into the 40s now. It got 25 at the last election. Consider before Helen Zille put her hat in the ring, was polling about 33. Now Helen Zille's endorsement, Helen Zille's name, likely pushing those numbers up to the high 30s and possibly into the low 40s. Now, remember, there was a time when people thought that the ANC wouldn't ever get out of Cape Town, back in 2004 or 5 maybe. And the DA script, I think it was 42%, if I'm not mistaken, and led an 8-party coalition. Now, I'm sure people at the time were thinking that that was against the odds. And Helen Zille proved everybody wrong for the first time, what would prove to be the first time of many times. But and the implication there, for people who understand these things, is that if the DA can win Johannesburg, they can then 2 or 3 years later win Gauteng provincial government for the DA outright, and the rest is history. And those 2 big provinces are firmly in DA's hands for all eternity. That's sort of the implication, and that is very possible. But to get to your question more specifically, the sort of kaleidoscope of political parties within the Johannesburg City Council. I mean, this really depends what number the DA lands on. If I think you could probably bet on the DA landing in the high 30s. That's not enough. The DA got 38% in Johannesburg in 2016, and that was a minority government. And kind of the point that Hermann is saying, you can get 47% and still be out of government in South African local councils. If you don't have that 3 or 4% to get you to the 51, that's the story of failed minority governments in SA's city council. So, I mean, I'm sort of answering your question quite a long way around, but I think if the DA were to do a deal with the ANC, I mean, I think they might have already done it if they were going to do a deal with the Joburg ANC at the moment. The numbers maybe are not entirely different. I guess if the DA overtakes the ANC by quite a bit, that does change that quite a lot. But it would be like a sort of microcosm of what you have at a national level. But just kind of wound down to a city level. But I mean, there are problems with that. I mean, some say that corruption and malfeasance runs quite deep within the ANC local caucus on the ground in Johannesburg. That would presumably stand in the way of Helen Zilla's plans to root out corruption in the city of Johannesburg council and the para-statals, para sort of semi-quasi-state run entities that run Johannesburg. And I think she said she wanted to set up a sort of hotline for whistleblowers and so on. So an ANC, even at 20%, it gives you the numbers, but it would presumably not work well with her calculation for, rooting out corruption, as I said, in the city of Johannesburg. If getting into the high 40s, I think a lot of that will depend on endorsements and who endorses Helen Zille and how much they endorse her, and the PR stunts that we may be about to witness that may be very special. That could be an extra 5 or 7 or 10 percentage points in itself. But you might be surprised who those people are and what entities those are, by the way. But yeah, I mean, again, you could get to 42% and still not have the reliable partners to get over the line. So I hope that answers your question to an extent. One thing I think a lot of people are not considering is this concept of overhang. So the ANC are going to win a lot of wards, and remember, the ward allocation is first past the post, a bit like the British system, the age-old problem of the British system. They won 60% of the seats, but only of the vote, but only got 30% of the seats. So a sort of similar thing might play out. I'll not get too much into it, but effectively the ANC dominates the Soweto and the broader Soweto area, and then the Alexandra and the Alex Township greater area. And because those are first past the post, unless anyone knocks the ANC out of those wards, it's going to be difficult to get the ANC down from 27 or so down to 22, 23, and that might keep the ANC up a little bit. So it's going to be very interesting to watch, needless to say.
I think despite the decline of the ANC nationally, provincially, and in the metros over the last 10 to 15 years, one should be wary of buying completely just the guaranteed decline of the organization of the party, from a sort of memory point of view, from an institutional point of view, from a resources point of view. There's still quite a way to go. And Hermann, just to ask you around the much vaunted ANC electoral machine. I mean, in polling that you've been doing, that you detail in your book as well, sort of tracking sentiment for political parties on social media. It's one thing to say now, so the next local government election should be the fourth quarter of next year, could be early 2027. So it's one thing to say now, it's just, the DA will get sort of 45% and higher in Joburg, the ANC is guaranteed to decline. But they tend to turn out the machinery in the run-up to an election, be it national, provincial. I know sort of local government elections turnout is lower, and that would probably hurt them. But what is your assessment of the party at the moment, the ANC specifically? Do they have the seriousness to deal with all the challenges they face and to still contest a local government election?
No. I think, of course, they are. Yes, thanks for playing along. They are a formidable organization, but I think what people should remember is that this is an organization that has really only been a political party for the last year. For most of the last century, not most of the last century, since 1912 to about May 29, 2024, the ANC were quite a few things. They were a social organization, they were a cultural organization, they were a charity, they were an NGO, they were a bit of a think tank, they were AfriForum before AfriForum was AfriForum, in the sense that they genuinely in the 1960s and 70s, you would find instances of service delivery or policing not being attended to in townships, and then the white local administrations would sort of whisper to black South Africans, go ask the comrades. The idea being that there are problems that the white government at the time couldn't solve in townships, and that the ANC could sort of have this civic activism, Afriforum flavor, almost a solidariteit flavor as well. And over many, many decades, they built up significant social capital. And then in 1994, actually starting with the UDF process, that social capital was transformed into political capital. So when the 1994 election came about, it wasn't that the ANC really won an election. They did that, of course. But what was actually happening at a subtextual level was that the ANC was cashing in decades and decades of social goodwill that it had built up through its various sister organizations and activities on the ground. It won a majority of 63%. And by 2004, after 10 years in power, perhaps the only period that they genuinely earned political capital, from 2004 onwards, they just lose it. And they sort of cling to what was won in the preceding half century until about the GNU forces them to face up to competitive politics, as it were. For the first time, they weren't approaching politics from a dominant position. They couldn't just count on controlling the government agenda. They couldn't count on making solo decisions on the budget, illustrating that quite powerfully, that both the ANC and National Treasury had their muscle memory checked when the object that they tried to lift, a GNU budget, was significantly heavier, and the muscle couldn't actually just repeat what it had done 20 or so times before. They also entered the perceptional game in a way that they've never had to before. They now had to compete against other ministers at a level of equality. And the Brenthurst Foundation polling earlier this year found that 5 non-ANC controlled ministerial portfolios were perceived as performing better than any of the other ANC portfolios, including the presidency. That was Gate McKenzie, and then Leon Schreiber, Sifiwe Gahube, John Steenhuisen, and I think Solima Latsi in communications. I'm not quite sure about that last one. But the fact was that the ANC, by November last year, you started hearing these rumors that they were unhappy that, quote unquote, the DA ministers were making them look bad. Now, that is competitive politics. Perception is the game. So if you perceive yourself, or if you create the perception and have yourself perceived as competent, then you earn political capital. So the ANC has only really been contesting politics in the democratic sense for a year now, and they prove not to be very good at it because they keep on losing. And there's something very, very interesting in the sentiment data that I've been monitoring since 2023. Usually, the ANC would have a gross sentiment score of about minus 40%, meaning that for every 10 positive mentions on social media and in news media, the ANC would have 14 negative mentions. So the deficit of, or there would be negative 40%. In January this year, very suddenly, and I'm not quite sure what explains it, but in January this year, around the 18th and 19th of January, sentiment perception towards the ANC plummeted to an average of minus 40% to between minus 60 and minus 80%. Now, there are many theories that could possibly explain that negative perception, and it's quite interesting that that dip happened exactly at the time of the ANC's NEC meeting in January, where they decided that there should be more aggressive interventions in the Gauteng and KZN ANC branches. Whatever the case may be, they fell out of they fell even further out of favor in terms of positive sentiment from the public. So when we look at the ANC heading into this coming election, they are approaching it, despite being the largest party, they are not approaching it from a position of any dominance. They are approaching it with more factional disunity than I think we've ever seen before. They approach it with perhaps the weakest leader that the party has ever had in the democratic era, and the heir apparent, Paul Mashatile, at this stage being one of, if not the most unpopular politician in the country. Their finances are in a mess. I mean, the sheriff has laid claim on some of their assets for 85 million rands of debt. And in a real sense, what has happened to the ANC is what the Conservative Party in the UK is dealing with, is people have just stopped listening to them. So even if they can come out with a message that resonates, their problem is that the public has, in a sense, really tuned out from taking seriously what they say. I mean, SRF polling data, when people are asked which party is best described with the phrase makes broken promises, 74% say the ANC, and for context, second in that negative ranking is the DA on only 8%. So the ANC is in a crisis of people having just tuned out from it, and more attractive parties for certain segments of its broad coalition, like MK, like the PA, appearing on the landscape. So when it comes to the formidability of the election machine, yeah, it will be formidable. They will likely make use, some dirty use of governmental powers and state powers, which they still have. But the painful fact for the ANC is that this is a party that hasn't really dealt with politics, competitive politics in the fullest sense of the word. They are the opposite of the DA, a party that scrapped itself through sheer grit and determination from a 1.7% party to a 30% party. The ANC is a party that inherited 60% positive social capital, transformed it into political capital, had one good spell for about a decade, and since then has never managed to earn political capital through competitive politics. So I'm not one of those people who think that the ANC has anything left. I think my gut feel tells me that, if anything, the collapse accelerates from this point, and once the floor is out, the floor is out. But I mean, that is a bit of speculation, but I think the facts and the crisis within the party, the disunity, the weakness of leadership, I think that bears out quite a pessimistic view of the ANC's future.
We covered a little bit of that in this morning's client risk alert, where we looked at in our sort of assessment, the lack of probability, the lower probability that the ANC will push any kind of meaningful reform, just because the focus so much is on just survival at this point in time. You see it, I think, most evidenced in the Madlanga Commission. You also see it in the, I guess, on pause again, national dialogue, where when the first sort of iteration of the National Convention was hosted in the form of a national dialogue, it's just another platform for South Africans to voice that and to point to the ANC as to quote President Ramaphosa, accused number one. And South Africans are going to use that at every opportunity. Sean, I'm going to come to you. Anything around sort of how things have been going in KwaZulu-Natal, in that particular provincial government, that gives you any kind of sign as to how things might play out in Gauteng? I mean, we've looked at Johannesburg, we've touched on Tshwane. One has to keep in mind Ekurhuleni as well. Do you think, I'm going to try to ask you to disprove my theory, which is that just because, one thing works in one province means it should work across the country.
Yeah. Okay. So KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa's second biggest province, if I'm not mistaken, by population and GDP. You can correct me on that. Yeah. I think I said on your show before, an extraordinary thing happened in late 23. The former president, Jacob Zuma, announced that he wouldn't any longer be standing for the African National Congress, the ANC, and started his own party, which had, of course, a provincial stronghold in KwaZulu-Natal. That party, I think, blew most expectations away by getting 45%. And again, still not an outright majority. What might be seen as an ideological ally within that province, the EFF got 2%. So together they were 47%, but that was not enough to govern the province outright. And the broader opposition of 4 parties was able to deny MK, EFF, and the province outright. Now, this coalition consists of the Nkata Freedom Party at, I think, about 18 or 19, the ANC at about 17 or so, the DI at about 13, and the NFP, a small Nkata Breakaway Party, at 0.51 seat. Now, those 4 parties collectively have 51%. And again, that boils down to my thesis. It was not my thesis, but Helen Zilla's thesis. But the thesis is that if parties that broadly are centrist or centre-right or right-leaning have 50% plus 1, then that coalition tends to hold. And the evidence on that across South Africa's provinces and municipalities is quite good. And one good example of that is Umlatuze Richards Bay. It's predominantly an Nkata municipality with support from the DA and deputy mayor. I think the DA have about 8 or 9% there. There's some other examples of that across KwaZulu-Natal's municipalities. I don't know if your question is specifically asking about the performance of the provincial government or about the municipalities within the province.
Yeah, more sort of provincial, and if there's anything you can read into Gauteng, if anything.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, these 4 parties, again, as I say, 50% plus 1, I kind of get a little bit of a sense of like schoolboy teenagers all staring at each other, saying like, you do it, you jump, you go in with MK. No, I'm not going to do it. You do it. No, I'm not going to do it. So if Nkata do it, they'll lose the premiership. If ANC do it, they're possibly scuppering their chances of ever governing in KwaZulu-Natal again, because this is about survival. If the DA won't do it because the DA it's diametrically opposed to their sort of thinking, so that's understandable that they wouldn't do it. And that one small party, the National Freedom Party, NFP. Remember, I think I said on your show before, if they jump, it's still not enough because it's still not 50% plus 1. So I could make it. Don't hold me to this. I know you South Africans love predictions, but don't hold me to this. But you could make potentially a strong argument that the provincial government in KwaZulu-Natal might last the full term against the odds, because I think they're all quite instinctively aware of what would happen if they jumped ship and moved over to the other side. So the ANC has the 2 big portfolios of education and health, which are the big provincial portfolios in South Africa. So if they jump sides, they probably wouldn't get those. They probably wouldn't get those portfolios. I think that accounts for the lion's share of the provincial budget. So. The mathematics and the politics landed in a way that gave the centre or the centre-right 51%. Now the question is, do you get that in the Gauteng provincial government or in Johannesburg City Council? As I say, you could trace it back to the DA's effort to get there in Johannesburg. And I agree with Hermann, it's going to take an enormous effort, earth-shattering effort for the DA to get into the high 40s. And they could dominate the northern suburbs and all that. I think people know that. There's about 10 or maybe more swing wards, if you like, that they could get on a good day. If I were the DA, I'd be analysing, I know they do this, analysing those wards that could swing their way. The last time I looked at it, there's about, I don't know, there's maybe 10 or 15 or more wards that could get into DA's hands. Remember, you just need to be first past the post. So that could push the DA up into the high 40s, potentially. And then I think the Freedom Front get about 1 or 2%. The Johannesburg ACDP get about the same. Nkata get about the same. You could make an argument that 45, if the DA landed on 45, that might be enough. It really just, it's kind of hard to say. There are some indications that the Patriotic Alliance might be prepared to go that way.
Mm-hmm.
So you could make an argument that, again, it could be 42. The DA might only need 42, repeat the Cape Town story. 45, I'd say, is starting to look safer. And 47, I would say you'd be over the line. Now, I think that, again, if Action South Africa, ASA, were 5 years later, they could have won in a lot of those wards in Soweto. And they could have got easily 20, 30% without eating into the DA's base too much. And the DA could have got 20, 30%, something like that. And the two of those could have got the numbers and got over the line in Johannesburg. It's a bit late now, maybe, I think. But if, to answer your question specifically, could you get the centre right, 50% +1 in Johannesburg, Gauteng? I think it all boils down to Soweto and what would happen in Soweto. Again, the ANC stands to, despite its logistical challenges, still stands to dominate those wards. So that's going to be very difficult. It would take the wheels to completely come off for them to really be knocked out of most of the Soweto wards, I think.
And just to add to that, I think why that is right is because those are the wards in which, or the areas, geographical areas, in which the ANC's social capital has been sort of hoarded over many, many decades. They didn't politic to win Soweto. They campaigned for decades non-politically to win Soweto, to entrench themselves so deeply there. So in terms of Soweto politics, it's not an honest, one political party against another political party. It is an entrenched social and cultural organization with deep civic activist roots over a century against other political parties. That is why those will be the last Johannesburg bastions of the ANC to fall, were they to fall, just simply because it's not straightforward politics there. An election there must go beyond winning political support and cut into social support, which is incredibly difficult to do. And something that I think Sean points out about KZN, which is worth noting, is that KZN is, despite being the province with the bloodiest history in terms of political violence, is also the province with a history of the most coalition government. Between 1994 and 2009, it was governed by coalition between the IFP and the ANC. Only in 2009, with the tsunami campaign of the ANC, did they win an outright majority there. So KZN has a rich coalition history, and identifying, I think, each party's relationship with MK is useful to understand why that coalition will likely hold, even if the GNU fails, because the IFP face an existential threat for Zulu domination from MK. So they fish in the same pond. They cannot honestly work together without being cannibalized by this larger, newer Zulu force, because throughout history, whatever ideological convictions the IFP might have had, the one thing that has remained constant is that they want to be the governors of the effective area of Zululand. So, and they know they're in a battle with MK for that. So the IFP can't work with MK. The ANC can't work with MK in KwaZulu-Natal. Well, can't is a strong word, won't, because what very conveniently happened for the ANC in KZN, in a way it's saving grace, is that the ANC that remained after the MK rout in KZN was the pragmatic ANC, the pragmatists, perhaps the lesser criminally aligned, lesser radical factions. That's who's left of the ANC there. So they've been the whatever sort of RET ideological national democratic revolution poison there might have been to a greater extent in the KZN ANC has largely been extracted and now sits in MK. So you won't have the moderate remnants of the ANC in KZN work with the radicals in MK, because also they'll eat each other's lunch. And then the DA has just a fundamental ideological clash with MK. So as long as each of those three parties cannot have a route to collaboration with MK, that government of provincial unity will likely hold. And the GPU in KZN happens to be one of the cautious foundations on which the DA in Joburg might be considering a grand coalition. Of course, they are not gunning for a grand coalition between the DA and the ANC in Joburg, but I know it is a point of discussion. And to that end, the thinking goes that in KZN, the ANC was humbled to a sub 20% position. And that party is now showing to be much more pragmatic and good faith in terms of collaboration. And the thinking goes that that might be the case for the Joburg ANC as well, that a sub 20% ANC in Joburg might have to be humble enough to collaborate in more good faith, or at least in better faith, with the DA than the current dominant ANC. Now, I'm skeptical of that thinking because I think the ANC in Gauteng under Panyaza Lesufi is a markedly different beast from the ANC in KZN, where only essentially the pragmatists or the lesser radicals remain. But I know that a grand coalition is being entertained as a necessary outcome to secure a Zilla mayoralty. But then, of course, what Sean said earlier comes into play. Can you fix a city with the people inside the tent pissing in? Essentially would be what would happen with a caterized civil service and the vested interests.
Just on KZN and on MK specifically, so we've had a few comments on eThekwini, and how, of course, Joburg is in and of itself the most important economically, but how things go in eThekwini will probably be a bit more interesting and more complicated. So I'd just like to ask you both what you think of MK at this point in time in October of 2025, when one looks at various leadership changes, however many secretary generals the party has had up until this point. Is it star still rising, or is this now, has it sort of reached the upper point, and is it going to decline from here? Sean, I'll go to you first.
Sure. Yeah. So I think Brent Hurst did a cities-focused poll in April of this year, and they polled eThekwini, Durban. So I think MK was on about 40 or 44, and then the DA was on about 24. The ANC was on about 20 or teens, and Nkata was on about 5 or so, something like that. Don't hold me to that, but something like that. Now, I think that 5 or a couple of percentage points here swing one way or another. I think that's largely what the eThekwini will end up like. There's some talk that the DA could overtake MK and be the largest party in the whole council. I'm skeptical of that. I'd be very, I'll have to see it to believe it, to see the DA on 40% in Durban eThekwini. That's not completely unlikely, but I'd say the DA will land on about 30 as things stand. The ANC in the teens, and Nkata maybe pushing 10, and between the three of them, they could go in. They would likely go in together, is my understanding. Now, kind of like what Hermann was saying, an ANC local caucus at 12% or 15% is a very different thing to a Leviathan ANC at 55, 60%. It's humbled, and it's about survival, and it needs to go in with who's going to win and who's going to stay there for the long term. So I would, from a risk perspective, I would bet that the eThekwini ANC would go in with the DA. The DA might hope that on a very, very good day, they could push high 30s, and Nkata could push 15, and that it could be DA IFP without the ANC. I'm skeptical of that. I don't think that as things stand, I don't think that would come to pass. But basically, a government of local unity, which, by the way, you'll see across all of KZN, because I think MK, even if it doesn't do quite as well in the local government elections next year or 27 as it did in 2024, it's still going to do well enough to bring the ANC down to 30s, 20s, or 10s in some cases, depending where in KZN. So you will likely see across a lot of the KZN municipalities a replica of the provincial government, i.e. IFP, DA, and ANC. And the order might be a bit different. The IFP might be first, DA second, ANC third. Some you might get, IFP first, DA second, ANC third, whatever the case may be. But yeah, so I think the chances of something that looks like the provincial government in Durban City Council, eThekwini City Council are pretty high. Yeah.
Hermann, I'm going to come to you just and then link it to the sort of left of South African politics. So if you want to add anything to what Sean said, but I'll then sort of give you the runway. Given where we've had now the verdict against Julius Malema, trying to figure out the prospects for the EFF going forward. I mean, do you think it's just the challenges that party that he and his party face? That means they won't really pose a threat to MK. So MK doesn't really have to worry about that particular issue going forward.
I think that's fairly right. I don't see significant overlap of areas of MK strength and EFF strength in the same space, and sort of that's understandable for quite a few reasons: ethnicity, tribal loyalty, language, but also, of course, that as I've said before, Julius Malema built his political messaging toolbox and his persona and his party's posture very much on the message from the latter days of Zuma's presidency of victimhood of the African masses exploited by white monopoly capital interests and apartheid-era collaborators. And the problem for Malema when MK came about and then the Zuma endorsement on the 16th of December 2023 really catapulted that party into the first tier of political parties. The problem for Malema was that people don't really go watch an Elvis impersonator tour if Elvis himself is back on tour. And that was the problem with Malema's Zuma Tribute Act, is why settle for Temu when Take a Lot is delivering. So that's part of why I think they don't naturally compete. Interestingly, the Progressive Caucus in Parliament, which was supposed to be this EFF MK join up and united front, has been a disaster in the sense that they haven't really accomplished anything. They haven't acted as a unit in any real way. The only time that they've notably voted together was with the DA when they opposed the VAT hike with the DA, the Freedom Front Plus, EFF and MK, four parties that you don't really typically see on the same side of any issue. But other than that, the Progressive Caucus as an oppositional force has been utterly unimportant, and in fact the relationship has been quite antagonistic with members from the EFF seeming to join MK because the EFF seemed to be a party on the down and the MK odd seemed better as a party in the ascendant. What is, I think, worthwhile in looking at the EFF's story going forward is, and we discussed this earlier in a staff meeting this morning, and there isn't sort of unanimity on this position. I think I might be a bit of a holdout here, but I think in Malema's legal troubles, there lies a kernel of massive opportunity for the EFF. So to put the facts on the table, Malema has been found guilty. The appeals process will now this be triggered within the next few months and so on. And the likelihood is that this process of appealing this sentence or this guilty finding and the subsequent sentence we're going to hear in January next year, this is going to take about 5 years, because Malema is the appellant party from this point forward, at least into the next court. And he will drag his feet, because why be in a rush when there's a really strong case against you, and where the Minimum Sentencing Act for this crime and this type of weapon fired off puts in place a 15-year minimum custodial sentence. Now that's quite a steep sentence, and people should understand that anyone with a sentence of more than 12 months or more as a custodial sentence for criminal sentence are barred from Parliament for a 5-year period. So Malema would essentially have to vacate his parliamentary seat if he gets found guilty in the final court where this thing turns. Now, why I think this is a good thing for the EFF is MK did really well in the election campaign last year through its martyrdom message. Jacob Zuma was a very, very good martyr candidate. And everything that happened to the MK party on that campaign trail could be rerouted to fit the message. For example, the IEC decides Jacob Zuma is ineligible to stand as a parliamentary candidate. MK party responds to that with, well, yes, of course they will say that, because he is a threat. He is this martyr and this persecuted warrior king. So, of course, the establishment will have to ban him from honestly contesting the election. And then a few weeks later, the electoral court said, actually, no, he can stand in this election. And MK said, of course he can stand in this election. He is the saving martyr warrior king returning to the great political battlefield. And then the Constitutional Court said, actually, no, he can't stand in this upcoming election. And MK said, of course he can't stand in this upcoming election. The establishment is terrified of this man. They have to throw everything at him, including the kitchen sink. So MK really milked that martyr narrative for the Zuma momentum, and EFF couldn't compete. They didn't have a similar martyr narrative, but now they might have just enough of one to re-grab some of that sort of revolutionary political street cred. Beyond that, in the more, I think, logistical sphere of party politics, Malema is starting to become a ceiling to his party support, I feel. You can only be the radical insurgent leader for so long. And if you do that for a decade, you sort of become part of the parliamentary furniture. And that's where Malema himself now is. His insurgency has become establishmentarian, in the sense that it is no longer fresh, it is no longer new. So as a political brand, his decade in power is sort of winding to a close. And the EFF, despite having talented people in it, like Sinawu Tambo specifically, I think is an impressive parliamentarian, these people have been prevented from rising in the EFF to the top leadership positions by the autocratic and authoritarian control of Malema of this party. So his removal, his forced removal, that doesn't depend on a factional regicide within the EFF, could be a gift to the EFF, who might realize, look, Malema is still important to our brand, but this is a golden opportunity for him not to be regicided, but just to be assided, put to one side, and allow the party to maintain his martyrdom, his radicalism, his brand, even if he is behind bars, and give over to some other political leaders who might bring something new to the EFF and help them renew their political offering. Now, am I saying this will happen? No. But the declining fate and the declining momentum of the ANC means that if a non-EFF-led, non-Malema-led EFF can at just the right moment cash in on a declining ANC to lift its vote share back into the teens, perhaps into 12, 13%, Malema will be in trouble in the sense because his party would have grown without him. And if you look at the timeline for what would happen, 5 years from now, let's say Malema loses his final court case, gets a custodial prison sentence of 12 months or more, it is then essentially 2030. He loses the ability to sit for the remainder of the 2029 parliament. He cannot contest for the 2034 parliament, so he only gets back into eligibility for parliament in 2039. That's a decade of political activity lost on this timeline, and the EFF could use that to maintain Malema's potency as a brand, yet neutralize him and move on to perhaps a new generation of more dynamic leadership, perhaps able to attract more aspirational politicians of the ideological bent necessary for the EFF.
Sean, on the EFF's decline and other sort of political formations, so we're coming into our final sort of 9 minutes of our discussion. Trying to put you on the spot here. Which party will get, or which, I guess, movement will get a higher share of the vote in 2029? Will it be the EFF or will it be Unite for Change, which is now this new entity of Build One South Africa, Good, and Rise Mzansi? And just to link to that, I want to ask you a bit about sort of, do you think we'll see a bit of a consolidation in South African politics? Maybe some of the smaller parties that many of which sort of try to fish in the DA pond?
Yeah. Those are good questions. Don't hold me to any of these predictions, by the way, on the 29th of June 2029, if I'm still around. But there we are. But no, look, I think in South Africa, a sort of extreme proportional representation system like South Africa, there's always going to be a far left element to it. It might be anything from 9% to 20%, depending on the day of the week and the sunshine and whatever way the wind blows. But whether it's Malema or whether it's Zuma, I think to an extent is kind of neither here nor there. It'll be in the sense that it'll always be there at a national level. Now, obviously, the implications for sort of provincial governments and municipalities where those parties perform best may be a little bit more serious, but yeah, there's always going to be that strong kind of element on the far left, as I say, 10, 15, 20%. I don't know, but and in that sense, I think there was never really space in the South African political system for two far left parties, or they were sort of always going to eat each other's lunch. The EFF were hoping to really make a breakthrough in KZN in 2024 and got 2%. So that obviously came, primarily from MK. So yeah, I think I would keep an eye on the cumulative total, the combined total of the far left vote in national polls, and I would bet that it wouldn't oscillate too much above 20-25%, if even that. So that's where I would be with that one. In regards to like the new political party now that's being formed between Rise Mzansi Bossa and excuse me, help me out with the third one. You put me on the spot. Rise Mzansi Bossa and Good, Patricia de Lille's
and Good.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think one shouldn't be dismissive of anyone partaking in the political arena. You shouldn't take that for granted. And it's a party putting themselves forward, contesting in political space in a free and open society, and that's fine. With respect to them, they didn't really make the breakthroughs that they were hoping for in 2024. I think Patricia de Lille got one seat, 0.25%, and the other two got two seats, both on 0.4%. So, politics is so hard, whether in the UK or in South Africa, and those two parties, Good and Rise and Bossa, they sort of had the images of like center-left parties, And I think your colleague Nicholas Lorimer made the point that South Africa lacks a good, credible centre-left party. And I think that's true, that one that could eventually in a future South Africa go in with the DA and govern quite well. That would be a good combination. But in the cases of Bossa and Rise, but a lot of their vote share came from Camps Bay and Sandton. So it wasn't actually, they weren't really the sort of centre-left parties that they had set themselves up to be. I think they probably would have done better if they were and didn't compete where the vote was already sort of settled. Now, I think I've written this at length on Biz News for Alacog. I think there is a huge appetite and market for a new political party, and it would be in Soweto, it would be in the townships, or in the sort of semi, sort of halfway between proper suburbs and halfway between township kind of areas. Sort of that would lean quite right, and as a matter of fact, tough on law and order, tough on reducing everything in the way of, any barriers to business, to employment, that sort of thing. So I think, I think that's why people got pretty elated about Hermann Mashaba. And I think if, as I say, if he were 5 years later, he might have cracked it. Because the ANC is in a much weaker position now. So, from a risk perspective, I would look at those factors. What kind of vote, what kind of demographic is it going after? And where is it campaigning, and where does it look to be making strongholds, making inroads? That's the sort of way I see the lay of the land at the moment,
Hermann, I'm going to come to you for the final word, and if I could also, obviously, you can link to sort of what Sean has covered for us on our shifting political competition, but also just your thoughts on what we as citizens, businesses should be looking at in terms of next, I guess, major, set things in the calendar, but also just what you think in terms of where are the forces sort of moving that people shouldn't be caught off guard by. I mean, the easy go-to is the medium-term budget policy statement. That'll be in October, late October, November. You look at, for example, the next ANC National Working Committee meeting and the next National Executive Committee meeting. Anything else that you think we should keep an eye on?
So a brief comment on the Unite behemoth of 1.04% is, I think politics is very hard, and people underestimate the logistical capacity and the logistical importance of actually just boots on the ground. To have activists or local members or local representatives to, have enough pens for a registration table, or have a gazebo for the registration table, or enough bottles of water, or a speaker for a Bluetooth speaker, or a plug-in speaker, or a human speaker for an event, or enough bread rolls and worstbroodjies. The real bloodline, or the real sort of heartbeat that allows the blood of politics to flow throughout the body politic is logistical, not ideological, and often not messaging. Now, I care massively about messaging, but the problem for smaller parties is that the logistical game is incredibly tough. And what helped the DP and later the DA was that it inherited the party structures of two formidable pre-1994 parties, the National Party and the PFP. Both had their own unique structures in different parts of the country, bringing these structural legacies to the DP. Of course, they had a setback in the 1994 election, but that merger then later with the National Party did allow them not necessarily to claim National Party skills, but National Party structures and a large set of the center-right conservative, mostly Afrikaner, mostly white vote. I always call them the 1992 yes voters. So for three parties coming together, and I was surprised they didn't call themselves good ones, Mzansi. These parties coming together, they really are up against the logistical challenge of making a difference politically. But then there's also the cynic in me that looks at these three politicians, Zibi, De Lille, and Maimane, and see them promising new stuff, but really not blazing a trail for new stuff. If you look at the Rise and Zanzi manifesto last year, it is large pieces of it feel copy and pasted from the 2006 or later Independent Democrat, 2004, pardon me, Independent ID manifesto. Then Bosa actually had a quite right of center political a manifesto promise, quite free market, quite small c conservative values, but then sort of align themselves now with I'm not quite sure what. And Zongezo Zibi, perhaps the party with the greatest claim of newness in last year's election campaign, I at some point during the election campaign, I just started counting the number of amandlas, awetus, that he would use in his speeches, just showing that even in his messaging, Rise and Zanzi was sort of clinging very much to the established way of doing politics. So the challenge for this Unite coalition will be, where do they get the infrastructure, the logistics, the on-the-ground presence to contest by-elections? Because we should remember, the two parties that had a breakout campaign last year, the PA and MK, where did really their momentum into a credible election performance start? In many cases, strong by-election performances. I remember in February 2024, we were all a bit uncertain as to what the polling was saying. Was MK truly a double-digit party? And then came three by-elections in KZN and one Mpumalanga, where they got 28% of the vote. And it was clear that this party was here to play. The same with the PA. They scared the DA and the ANC they won victories in Swartland and in Oudtshoorn, which really put them on the serious trajectory to grow their support from the 29 election to the 24 election by, roughly 5,000%. So in the end, new politics is cruel because it assumes or it requires a level of logistical boots on the ground capability that I think people underestimate and that they miss in the real storyline of successful parties in South Africa. The EFF, the ANC Youth League structures and sort of informal resources and structure network, the ANC, their social structures, the DA, the PFP and NNP structures. So the three MK, the hijacked ANC structures in KZN. So if we look at the four parties that are formidable, they are structurally sound parties. Now, of course, with issues, but that's the difference between a serious political party in South Africa and the unserious ones. It's not how many Twitter followers, it is actually your on-the-ground presence. And that, where I would look for as a risk advisory heading into the next year's election, is keep an eye out for the typical signs of political organization. Do you see posters? Do you see flyers? Do you see WhatsApp messages coming through? Do you see organic responses on Facebook groups? That would be and of course, by-elections. Those will be the things directing attention to failing or building political parties into this cycle.
And if there is one, I think, excellent point at which to track all of that and to make sense of it, it is here at the CRA, where we try and make sense of and link the headlines to the business pages, where we try and make sense of the political economy as well as just the normal economy. If the line goes up, does that mean things are improving, or does it mean we need to look at things a little bit deeper? So I think on that note, Hermann, thank you very much for advising us on what to look for going forward into the next local government elections. Sean, to you, thank you very much for your time, your analysis. We greatly appreciate it. To all of you who made time with us this evening, thank you for joining us. If you are not yet a CRA client, I should ask you why that is the case. We invite you to contact us right away. You can schedule a standalone briefing, or you can sign up to become a premium client. You can find all of that information on our website. You can also contact us directly to get more information on the subscription option. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Have a great evening, everyone, and take care.